Really don't know what I'm doing, huh?
So let's go ahead and move this out of the way. And let's go ahead and set up our station. And I like to just use a trash bag for this. So I'm going to be working on just the cover for the Book of Bill. So for the base, I'm going to be using an 8x6 book from a company called Leather Village. So the outside of this book isn't the most ideal for this project, but I really like the foundation of this and I think I can really get this to work out. So here I'm just going to be cutting out my template and I'm going to be tracing this onto a 12x12 20 gauge piece of stainless steel.
Ordered this like 2 weeks ago. I'm super excited about it.
And let's go ahead and remove that protective film on both sides. And I probably could just leave it and then just kind of peel it off afterwards, but I'm a really impatient person, so I'm just going to do it now. From there, I can go ahead and start tracing out my design. For this particular project, I'm going to need 8 of these corner protectors, 1 lock, and a couple smaller pieces for those corner protectors. So the part I think is going to be the hardest here is I'm going to have to make a hole for that little lock. So I'm going to go ahead and try to cut that out now while I still have the entire sheet instead of having a really small piece trying to cut out. And I'm thinking the 5/16 bit is going to be my best bet here. And then using a nail, I'm going to make a little pilot hole for myself. And I'm doing that just so the drill doesn't move out of place.
You know, it never occurred to me how strong stainless steel is. Probably why they build everything out of this stuff.
And I had my suspicions when I noticed the drill bit really wasn't making any progress. Eventually I did manage to pop a hole into the sheet, but when I tried to use my tin snips to try to cut out the smaller details, that's when I really noticed that I wasn't making much progress on this, in that my mistake was trying to get a piece of stainless steel instead of something like aluminum, which is a much softer metal. So while that sheet of aluminum comes in, let's go ahead and work on the book for now. And the first thing on the agenda is we got to get rid of all these excess leather pieces here. And they should come off relatively easy, because I can't really imagine the glue that's holding this is all that strong. And to cut it, I'm just going to be using my X-Acto knife for this.
I really hope I didn't cut too much. Honestly, it feels like I cut too much.
So as I'm peeling away this fake leather, I've noticed that the cut I made might have been a little too high, and a little bit of that cardboard is showing through. And the fear I have there is that it's going to rip really easy if I just kind of pull on the book a little too hard. Because right now the only thing holding it in place is just a single page.
Honestly, why did I even think that was a good idea?
But I feel like this is an easy fix as long as we keep some of that leather pieces. So before I repair the page, I'm going to go ahead and cut off the corner protectors. And to make sure I don't make the same mistake, I'm just going to make the cuts only on the top part of the book, just in case those corner protectors are holding things in place. And then I'm just going to go ahead and repeat that on the opposite side.
See, that's how it should have cut it the first time.
And with just a little bit of super glue, we can go ahead and reattach some of those pieces. And to really make sure it stayed in place, we're going to add an extra bead of super glue. And then we're going to come back over it with a little bit of baking soda. When you mix super glue and baking soda, you get almost like a plastic-like substance, and it's really sturdy. But for my purposes, I'm going to go ahead and sand it down a little bit. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect since the Book of Bill is really heavily textured, so just a light sanding will do fine. And because I messed up the other side, this is now going to be the front of the book. So I'm going to go ahead and draw on my design, and I'm thinking to get a really nice texture, I'm going to be using this engraving tool right here. Now, it's nothing fancy. I picked this up at Walmart for around $25, I believe. They had a few better ones, but they definitely had some worse ones as well.
This is just not my day, huh?
So the engraving tool didn't really work out, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to Old Reliable. And I'm just going to use an X-Acto knife to cut this out. It's going to be a little bit more tedious, but I should get a really nice result. So one thing I have to keep in mind while cutting this out is I have to make sure that I'm not just going surface level when cutting out the leather. I want to make sure to dig in about a 1/4 inch into the cardboard, just so that I have a really nice recessed area to add my epoxy later. If I don't make the cut deep enough, the epoxy can easily spill over and kind of mess up the idea I have in my head here.
You're trying to scrape off these little fuzzies, but they're not really coming off.
So to try to clean it up a little bit, I'm just going to go ahead and grab some blue painter's tape and try to pick up as much of this stuff as I can. Painter's tape works out really well here because it is sticky, but it's not sticky enough to rip off any of those little small details. And using that same X-Acto knife, we're going to go ahead and open up the spine just so we can see what's underneath. Supposedly there's an actual spine inside the spine, so I want to go ahead and try to do something to reflect that. And to start this out, I'm going to do just a rough draft of where I want the ribbed areas to be. So for my first attempt, I'm going to go ahead and try to carve out this cardboard. That way, when I put the leather back over it, it has more of a ribbed look to it. But the cardboard ended up being really flimsy and easily came off. So for attempt number 2, I'm going to place down super glue and try to go over it with some baking soda. That way I can have a solidified design in this area. And so that I don't accidentally glue my fingers together, I'm going to brush over it with just a cheap brush I had laying around.
That genuinely looks horrendous.
Which turns out to look really bad. And so I'm just going to go ahead and sand that off and go with attempt number 3. So the idea here is very similar to the last one, but instead of using super glue, I'm going to be using a leather filler paste. And so trying to follow the same design as I did previously, I should get a much smoother look to it this time. And then to try to speed up the drying process, I'm just going to use a regular hair dryer just to help speed up things.
Yeah, no, I can't be bothered to wait this long.
Which also kind of ended up in a failure. So we're going to move on to attempt number 4 now. So while I was cleaning off the paste, it occurred to me, maybe I can just kind of use this paper towel and glue that into place. Which turned out to be the worst one of all the ideas so far.
I hope I'm seeing things, because that looks like the book's on fire.
Which moves us on to attempt number 5. So for this attempt, I'm going to go ahead and remove the original leather, and I'm going to be replacing it with my own leather. This does kind of put a damper in things because I wanted to keep the original leather, but I just can't seem to find a way to keep it in place. So the idea for this one's pretty simple. We're going to cut out a bunch of little rectangles, and I'm thinking that I can kind of have them overlapped and make almost like a little ribbed texture. And this would kind of give the illusion of like the spine underneath. And to take it a step further, I'm going to go ahead and shape the bottom of each piece of the leather into almost like a little pointed shape. This is just so I can have a little bit more visual texture going on.
Yeah, see, that one looks a lot better. I think we have a winner here.
And so to glue this in place, I'm thinking about using a little bit of Gorilla Epoxy. I've had really good success with it in the past, and I think it's going to work out really well here too. And it's pretty simple to use. It already comes in a 1-to-1 ratio. And so once you get your desired amount, you're going to go ahead and mix it for a minute or 2, and then it's ready to use. Now there is one major drawback to this epoxy though. This epoxy only has about 5 minutes before it starts curing, and depending on the temperature of the room, this will actually increase or decrease. And the room I work in is slightly colder, so my dry time is roughly around 7 minutes, which still doesn't give me much time to work, so I'll have to place these down as quickly as I can.
It's extremely crooked, huh? That's fine. So, since the paste was still wet, the first one actually never glued down, which works out perfect because it lets me add an additional strap that I can actually epoxy onto the book.
So cutting out a strip of leather, I'm going to be able to add a little bit more roundness to this spine. It's not going to be a drastic curve, but it is going to give it a little more shape. And it'll give me a little bit more flexibility when epoxying it to the book itself. And so my goal here is to not have it fully attached to the book, but I need it to stay in place when I add in the rest of the epoxy. So for this gluing process, I'm just going to add a small bead of epoxy down the center. And to hold everything in place, I'm just going to use a little bit of Blue's painter tape. So it's been roughly around 12 hours at this point, and I think it's safe to say that the epoxy is fully cured, or at least cured enough for me to add in more epoxy. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove the blue painter tape, and then we can go ahead and mix up some more epoxy.
I don't know how I keep forgetting to turn off this light.
And so it's a very similar process, but this time I'm going to basically use up the rest of this epoxy so that I can really have this leather piece attached. And since that center is already glued down, I don't have to worry about this moving. And so here I'm just cleaning off some of that excess that fell out. And again, we're going to go ahead and tape it up, except this time when I put down the painter's tape, I want to use an excess amount this time because I want to keep this as flush as possible. So it's been drying for about a day at this point, and I feel like it's safe to go ahead and remove all the tape. And I'm really liking the texture it has here. The only problem is it has really hard cuts, and since this is supposed to be underneath the leather, I'm going to try to use that paste to try to smooth out all the edges. And I don't want to add too much because I don't want to lose the texture that I've already created here. So while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and use a brand new X-Acto knife, and I'm going to go ahead and replace the old one that I have. I'm going to try to trim off a little bit of that leather that's hanging over, just so that it's a little more flush with the book itself. It's not entirely necessary, but it is going to be something that bothers me. And with the brand new blade, everything cuts extremely smooth. And then I'm just going to repeat that on the opposite side as well. This side didn't cut as well because the blade was already dulled down a little bit, which is perfectly fine in my opinion. And so that the lettering has a little bit of a texture to it, I'm going to go ahead and just do a shallow cut and remove just the top layer of this book. And so next, I'm going to go ahead and start texturing the top part of the book. But before we do that, I'm going to have to add a couple guidelines just so I don't get lost or over texture areas that don't need it. And so for the texturing part, I'm going to go ahead and use that same leather paste and apply that to the entire surface. By doing it this way, I can add very little amount at a time and give me a very organic looking surface. And then to help blend in that spine, I'm going to go ahead and add a generous amount of paste just to help smooth things over. The paste doesn't take too long to dry, roughly around 6 hours. It does become a little tedious waiting for things to dry, but you do have to be patient, otherwise you risk messing up the texture that you took time to put down. And here I'm going to be adding really deep cuts just so that I can match the reference a little bit better. And to further add texture, I'm going to go ahead and use that same engraving tool and then just drag that across the surface in completely random areas. And so now we can go ahead and work on the back side of the book. I've added my guidelines here, and I want to keep in mind that I do want to put a strap going across, and I want to keep that surface fairly smooth so when I glue it down, I have more surface to work with.
Can't forget the lines.
So for the back side of the book, I want to keep in mind that the zodiac can't have any texture on it. Otherwise, painting that zodiac symbol is going to be extremely difficult. And when the light hits it, it's not going to show all that well. So I'm going to try my best to avoid that center while still adding a little bit of texture in between, so that it's not too obvious that I try to avoid it. So it's been about 15 hours since I've messed with this, and the surface is a little too rough for my taste, so I'm going to go ahead and sand that down a bit. And so now that both sides have been textured, we can go ahead and try to add on that leather strap. And it also has 3 strings going down the center. And for that, I'm going to be using this leather string. Because it's going to be really difficult to remove the glaze once the strings are attached, I'm going to go ahead and remove all that glazing now while I still have the chance. And I'm just going to be using a leather deglazer.
I gotta remember to use gloves because this stuff does burn your hands.
And with just a paper towel soaked in the deglazer, I'm going to go ahead and just try to wipe off as much as I can. And I might as well go ahead and go over the front of the book and the back as well. And this stuff doesn't take too long to dry, it's just a few minutes. So for those leather strings, I'm going to go ahead and make 3 pilot holes, and to do that, I'm going to use my engraving tool.
I don't know why I keep using this tool, it really doesn't do anything.
And because the engraving tool wasn't strong enough, I'm just going to use my drill to make some holes. And for those holes, I'm just going to be using a 5/32 drill bit. And the drill makes really quick work of those holes. And so now we can go ahead and move on to the string. I want to make sure I have excess string here. That way I have plenty to work with and I can go ahead and trim off any excess as I'm gluing. So I could use epoxy here, but I'm thinking super glue is going to be a little bit easier to work with, as the dry time goes from a few minutes to a couple seconds. So I'm just going to add a little bead of super glue inside that hole, and I'm just going to put the string inside there. And then I'm going to go ahead and repeat that for all 3 strings.
I don't know how anyone can work with gloves, it's so difficult.
And so for the gluing process on the opposite side, it's pretty simple. All you're going to do is trim off the excess and then go ahead and glue that into place. And this part really isn't necessary, but I really don't like when aspects of a project move around. So I'm going to go ahead and add a small bead of super glue underneath that string and attach it to the spine of the book. And that should be enough just to lock everything into place. For For the leather straps, I already kind of cut these in half and just kind of tapered them on the edges. That way they kind of have like a rounded texture to them. And just to keep them from moving around, I'm going to add just a little bit of tape down the center just to hold them in place while I glue down the edge. And then similar to the leather strings, I'm going to be using super glue for this one. Because if I use something like epoxy, it might fall into those crevices where the string meets up with the spine of the book. All I really have to do is glue down one edge, and then I can go ahead and remove the painter's tape. From there, it'll be as simple as just adding a small bead of super glue and folding that over the book. And just like how we added super glue to the cover repair, we're going to add a small bead of glue around those straps as well. And to smooth it out, I'm just going to use another piece of leather. And then just to help everything seal into place, we're going to add just a little bit of baking soda around those edges. And then just a little light sanding just to smooth it over. And then we can go ahead and deglaze that last little bit and then hit the front and the back cover again, just in case we missed something.
Next time you're at McDonald's, go ahead and order yourself a hot and a spicy, add pickle, extra mayo. It'll change your life.
Now that I'm done stress eating, I'm going to go ahead and dye this book black. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and put on some gloves because the ink I'm going to be using is a little bit on the strong side.
It's just some days these rings really bother me.
Now the ink that I'm going to be using is from a company called Dynamic, and the ink is specifically meant for tattooing, but it works really well as a dye. It's very liquidy and it falls into all those crevices really easy, and a little bit of ink goes a really long way, so I don't even have to use too much for this one. Nor do I even have to put on a second layer, as one layer is more than enough for this one.
And I'm just going to let that dry for 30 minutes.
For the top of the book, I want to get a really leathery look, so I'm going to be using these leather paints from Angelus, and I'm going to be using a technique called dry brushing. Now, dry brushing is when you have as little paint as possible on your brush, and you're just lightly going over everything. What this will do is it'll catch all the high spots while leaving the lower spots alone. This will just help add depth to your project. That leather paint doesn't take too long to dry, so I can go ahead and move on to the next part. Before I add any of the resin, I'm going to add a base layer of red, just in case some of that cardboard shows through. And I'm going to be using a color called Red Riot from the exact same company, Angelus. And so that none of that paint rubs off easily, I'm going to go ahead and add a clear lacquer. And I'm going to be using Rust-Oleum Chalked matte finish. And that's going to need at least 24 hours to fully dry. So in the meantime, let's go ahead and try cutting out the metal bits again. This time around, I'm going to be using a 12x12 plate of aluminum, and I believe this one's 24 gauge. Now this is a much softer metal and it's a lot thinner than the last one, so I should be able to cut it without any issues. So just like last time, we're going to want to cut out that lock hole before we start making any of those smaller cuts. It'll be much easier to work with while it's still intact.
Wow, that looks really bad.
So attempt number 1 didn't work out so well. So we're going to go ahead and try a different technique this time. So I'm going to drill out the center, and I'm thinking with this tool right here, I can go ahead and kind of chisel out the design. They're pretty sturdy tools, and I really think I can get away with doing it. Today's sponsor, me.
If I ever get a sponsor, I'm just going to add them in the most random places.
So at this point, I'm now beyond frustrated, and I'm just going to go ahead and move on without cutting that hole. So I'm going to be wearing cut-resistant gloves here because this stuff is really sharp, and I'd rather not cut my hands today.
Please cut! I did it!
So the cut's not perfect, so I'm just going to try to sand it down with a file and hope for the best, and then retrace on the design before cutting it out.
Yeah, I did that on my first try.
And then I can go ahead and cut everything else out. It's going to be extremely repetitive, but it has to be done. And so that I don't accidentally cut myself later down, I'm going to go ahead and sand those all down. So 24 hours have passed, and I think we can go ahead and start working on the resin part. Now I'm going to be using art resin, and that comes in 2 parts. It's going to be the resin part and then the hardener.
Yeah, I'm not going to do any measurements. I'm just going to eyeball it.
Now, art resin's a little tricky because you do need to have a perfect 1-to-1 ratio, because if you don't mix it properly, this stuff will just never cure and it'll permanently stay sticky. And this is going to be my first time dyeing any resin, but I've seen good reviews on this brand right here, and it's just going to be a red mica powder from a company called Marblers. Now, from what I read, you're actually supposed to measure this
I'm
out.
just going to leave it open like this because I know it's going to bother someone.
But I'm just going to take a rough guesstimate as how much I need.
It looks like a good amount, right?
And then I do have a really long work time with this one. This stuff doesn't even try to start solidifying until at least an hour or two in. It takes about 24 hours to be dry to the touch and about 48 hours to be fully cured. So there's no rush and I can take my time here. To remove any of those bubbles, if you use something like a torch and keep it about 1 or 2 inches away from the resin, you can pop all those bubbles really easily.
Yeah, that's not good.
It's been about 6 hours and it should be just dry enough where I can move it out of the way. So while that takes the next 2 days to cure, let's go ahead and glue some of these pieces together. So I need to work on 8 corner protectors, and they're not too complicated. They're just 3 pieces that need to be glued together. So using some Gorilla Epoxy, I'm just going to go ahead and just glue all these pieces together.
I was too lazy to record it, but for these little rivets, I used just these little tiny rivets.
So these have sat for about 24 hours now, and I can go ahead and move these out of the way. Now the epoxy isn't fully cured yet, but as long as I'm careful, I can get away with adding some extra paint. So I'm just going to add a quick layer of dry brush, just because I lost some of that detail when I added that clear coat. And then I'm going to go ahead and move on to a technique called glazing. Now this is normally just an oil painting technique, but I'm going to attempt to add it to the cover of this book. Now glazing is when you use a really transparent color to add little color shifts to a painting. It's a great technique to add a lot of depth. So I'm going to be using a product called Liquin, and I'm going to be using the colors Burnt Sienna, Cadmium Yellow, Crimson Red, and Ochre's Green. And that'll take roughly around 15 hours to dry. For the corner protectors, I kind of want to add an oxidation layer to them, and the only dish I have available is this one right here, which is the coffee I've been using for Journal 3. And because I don't want to waste it, I'm going to go ahead and pour it into this cup, and then put that off to the side for now. Let's go ahead and place in our metal bits. And to oxidize the metal, I'm going to be using vinegar and just a generous amount of salt.
Might as well clean my brush.
So the fumes that this is producing is what's going to cause that oxidation, but to really make sure it oxidizes, I'm going to add a little bit of vinegar on top of each piece. And if I'm lucky, this will cause it to rust as well.
It's been 20 hours. It shouldn't be taking this long to oxidize. I really don't know what I did wrong here.
And so this is a first for me where I didn't have it oxidized, but that's okay. I have other ideas. Idea number 2. I'm going to be using shoe polish and some liquid from the Eternal Coffee. When it dries, it should give me a really nasty looking color.
And then just make sure to salt it to taste.
So at this point, the epoxy should be fully cured, and I want to add just a small rim of a darker red around the edge, just to add a little extra depth to that logo in the center. And once I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and hit it with another clear coat. So I'm really surprised at how well these came out, because I didn't think they were going to come out all that well. The only downside is that they're a little dark, and so to help fix that, I'm going to go ahead and dry brush on a silver paint from Craft Smart, and that should only take a few minutes to dry. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and use a clear varnish and try to make that outside Zodiac a little bit shinier. From the reference I'm using, this is supposed to be extremely shiny, so I'm just going to try my best and outline it the best I can. And then from there, we can go ahead and epoxy on all the corner protectors. And I'm going to be using that same epoxy I've been using. Now the reference makes it look like this journal is supposed to be a matte finish, so I'm going to try to tone down some of that glossiness by just hitting it with the deglazer.
All it did was make it sticky. Honestly, I'm just going to call it done. It's done. you thought I forgot to put this back, huh? I didn't forget.